Wow, that was awesome. I just kind of float over here, you know? Oh, boy. Wow. So I get the chance to introduce our guest speaker. And after that, what are you talking about again? Wow. That music was so good.
Praise
Yeah,
Darwin.
yeah, right. I am just thrilled to introduce our speaker. He talks about the marriage of science and spirituality, and that is so exciting to me. It's so relevant today. And Michael has documentaries done on public television, United Nations presentations, and we're just in for a real treat today. So that having been said, Michael Dowd.
Wow. It is a joy to be back here at Vision because, as some of you know, between the time that I was here last and now, I went through a very serious bout of cancer. I had a tumor the size of my fist in my spleen. Went through 6 rounds of chemotherapy and then had my spleen removed 4 years ago. And I'm happy to report that I've had 3 CAT scans since then, and I show no sign of cancer. But I don't take life for granted either. Yeah, I want to introduce my beloved bride, Connie Barlow, here with me at the front. Connie will be at the book table afterwards. I want to speak this morning on something that I've never really spoken about in this way. This is, sometimes Connie and I have spoken to some 2,000 groups over the last 12 years. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we've been traveling North America for the last 12 years, speaking in all kinds of religious and non-religious settings on the marriage of science, basically where science, inspiration, and sustainability intersect. So we speak to groups, literally from evangelicals to atheists and everything in between. And we focus on the sacred side of science. That is what reality is revealing through evidence and how that can enrich our lives individually and also enrich our relationships so we have healthier, more vital, more vibrant relationships and where we can work together and are inspired to work together in the service of a healthy future for all of us. And it's just such an honor, it's such a privilege to be able to be in such diverse religious and non-religious settings taking the same message, the same sacred science, in a way that helps us, even as religious people, value our differences, that we don't all have to have the same metaphysics. We don't have to have the same theologies. Trust me, most folks don't have this quality of music. We need to work on that for the other folks. But I want to speak on something that a lot of us who are in the New Thought movement aren't necessarily aware of. It's sort of the cutting edge of what's happening in the world in a way that, in many ways, Ernest Holmes and the Fillmores and other New Thought leaders, in a sense, were a couple of generations ahead of their time, and now science and other religious traditions are catching up in this regard. And that is the awareness that any understanding of God that is not synonymous with the all, reality, ultimacy, nature, is a trivial and inconsequential notion of God. That God cannot be understood in a way that is separate from or outside of or disconnected from nature, reality. In fact, what I would say that I would make the case that the single most important religious revelation of the last 100 years can be summed up in one word: personalize, personify. Anthropologists in the West took us down a path that was not helpful. And that is where we started thinking of gods and goddesses as disembodied entities, disembodied spirits, rather than personifications of some aspect of reality or reality as a whole. For example, Helios, or Sol, S-O-L, was not the god of the sun or the spirit of the sun, as if there was some non-material entity separate from this big ball of flame and light that gives us life. Soul, or Helios, was a personification of that ultimate reality that every entity on earth is dependent upon, other than the bacteria that live way down in the crust. And so Gaia was not the goddess of the earth or the spirit of the earth. Gaia was a personalization of what we today call, in a depersonalized way, Earth, or even worse, the Earth, little e. Have you ever heard anybody talk about the Venus, the Mars, the Jupiter? You know, little j, little, yeah. No, it's Venus, Mars. These are gods and goddesses. These are proper names. Earth is a proper name, rather than the Earth, little e, which is just the dirt, you know. Martin Buber, in fact, let me back up and give you just a little sense of where I've come to. Connie and I woke up to climate change. Somebody said before the service, is like, boy, he's written an awful lot of books. Well, then they looked, it's obviously not all my books out there. Connie and I are, this year, we woke up about a year and 3 months ago to climate change. Now, we've both been aware of global warming and climate change for decades, but we didn't get the urgency of it until just maybe a year and a few months ago. And so now it's become, rather than back burner, it's become front burner. And the reason we're in Southern California right now is that we are cheerleading and supporting the Great March for Climate Action. There's going to be about 100 marchers that are 100 full-time marchers, and then another 100 part-time marchers that are going to march some segment of the route. But about 100 full-time marchers are going to be going from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., marching 3,000 miles over 8 months, beginning March 1st in L.A., and then arriving, ideally, we'll see what happens, on November 1st, a week before midterm elections. And the whole idea is to raise consciousness and put pressure on Congress to tax carbon, to put a fair price on carbon, so we no longer allow the free or subsidized polluting of the commons. Yeah. I mean, it's important that we all lessen our, ecological footprint, that we lessen our carbon footprint and change light bulbs. All that's cool, and it's important. To fly a little bit less, to drive a little bit less, all that's important. But there are certain things that we can only do systemically. And putting a fair price on carbon is the most important one, because then that brings the entire power of the market globally to bear in helping us do the right, just ecological thing. We start making the right decisions once that happens. So that's one of the main things. So that's why we're here, because we've got 70 speaking engagements over the next 9 months, and this is the first. Yeah. And so I'll be sharing a whole lot more in terms of this bridge-building perspective in the 90-minute workshop that I'll be doing early this afternoon after lunch. But I want to just share, just briefly this morning, this sense that reality is God and evidence is Scripture. Now, again, this is probably preaching to the choir here, but this is going to be news to some of your neighbors. See, when I speak to Christian audiences, I get pretty bold. In fact, I'll be speaking in a number of Christian churches over the course of this next 9 months. And one of the things that I'll be saying that's sort of not politically correct is that Christians, Muslims and Jews, the monotheistic traditions that have thought of God as a supernatural entity who resides off the planet and outside the universe, have trivialized God. That we've betrayed reality. We've betrayed God with this kind of otherworldly, I call it idolatry of the otherworldly and idolatry of the written word. Where we've made an idol, thinking that God's best guidance comes in ancient texts. And where God resides is outside nature. That as long as we think that way, we will inevitably destroy our world. In fact, Gregory Bateson, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, this is a direct quote. He says, if you imagine God as outside and beyond nature, and you see yourself as in the image of God, you will naturally and inevitably view yourself as above and outside of nature. He said, if this is your estimation of your relationship to nature, and you have an advanced technology, your likelihood of survival will be that of a snowball in hell. You will die either of the toxic byproducts of your own hate or simply from overpopulation and overgrazing. You could add climate change there. It matters how we think about God and how we think about divine guidance. If we think of God as outside nature, and if we think of God's best guidance as locked up in ancient texts, we will be not present to God's presence in each other and in the natural world. We will not be present to God's guidance through every fact discovered by science. In fact, we'll be thinking of science and facts as just secular. All the cool religious and spiritual stuff is over here. That's just secular. We will be blind and deaf to God's presence and God's guidance. And we can no longer afford that, folks. We need to realize that facts are God's native tongue. That God, and again, I use the word God and reality synonymously. God is a personification, a sacred name for what is fundamentally, undeniably, inescapably real, whether you believe in it or not. In fact, one of my favorite quotes, Philip K. Dick says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. So what can we say confidently is real, whether we believe in it or not? Well, I think there are at least three things. Reality, I mean, nature is real, whether you believe it or not. In fact, I've often said, I heard somebody say, that reality is what you bump into when you close your eyes and walk in here. So nature is real, whether we believe it or not. Not just our outer nature, but our inner nature. See, this doesn't deny the subjective leading of God. God leading us through our feelings, through circumstances, through relationships. So our inner nature is real. Our outer nature, the natural world, our social nature, and our interpretive nature. This is one of the places where the New Thought movement is ahead of all the other religions in the world, is focusing on the necessity of realizing and taking responsibility for our interpretive nature. Notice, reality just is what reality is, but then how we interpret reality has a profound impact on the quality of our life and the quality of our relationships. In fact, have any of you had a conversation with some humanist or atheist or science-oriented friend or neighbor or somebody maybe, in your family or whatever, and, and they sort of, you talk about God is love and love is all and we're part of that, and they sort of roll their eyes? I'm going to give you a way to talk to them that are going to leave them speechless. Because let's just take one sort of principle. The universe is conspiring on my behalf. Okay? Reality is for me. Okay? No matter what happens, I can interpret that as the universe conspiring on my behalf. Now, when you're talking to your humanist or atheist or science friend, here's one way to do it. Say, no, okay, would you grant that there's subjective reality and there's objective reality? Well, of course, they're going to say yes. Okay, great. So I would not try to argue and prove in a scientific way that the universe is conspiring on my behalf. I mean, bad things happen. Planes crash. And it's not like God or the universe singled out those people to die. No. So, I mean, I think the universe would just as soon kill me in terms of just nature. I think nature's consciousness is so much greater than humans. I mean, think about just a cell. How does a cell work? The problem is we've made almost an idol of our own form of consciousness. So we think our consciousness is the best, the top of the, No, I don't think that's the case. I think our consciousness could end up killing ourselves if we're not careful, if we don't come into right relationship with our inner nature, our outer nature, our social nature, and our interpretive nature. So from an objective standpoint, I would never try to argue and prove in a scientific way that nature is conspiring on my behalf. Okay, so right there, you've got all your humanist atheist friends, they're going to be right with you. They're going, okay, yeah, cool, right, that's true, yeah, that's the way it is. Now, let's talk about subjective nature. Let's talk about subjective reality. We now know, we don't believe this, we now know there is a boatload of scientific evidence that individuals who believe that reality is conspiring on their behalf, that the universe is conspiring on their behalf, are happier, they're healthier, they live longer lives, they have healthier relationships, and here's where you can hook your atheist friend, they attract more mates. Because they're more likable people, so they leave more prodigy, right? Okay? So over the course of evolutionary history, evolution would have selected, this is a scientific term, would have selected for the belief that reality is conspiring on my behalf, that God is for me, the universe is on my side. That's an evolutionarily, it's a useful belief that would have been selected for through countless generations at the individual level. But here's the interesting thing, also at the group level. Any tribe who believed that God was on our side, that universe it's for us, would have outcompeted a bunch of selfish atheists or selfish people who thought there is no reality, whatever, okay, you know. Because these people don't cooperate in the same way. So at group level and at the individual level, the belief that reality is on our side, the universe is conspiring on our behalf, would have been selected for. And there's nothing that your science-oriented friend would debate about that, because both of those are grounded in fact. So here's the thing. As a father, I've got 3 kids. How did I raise my kids? You bet God loves you. Reality is for you. And when you interpret life that way, your life, I'll say this. When somebody cuts me off on the road, I may have a few seconds of anger. Yeah, I'm human. I'm normal. But within literally seconds, I may say to myself, okay, how's this the universe conspiring on my behalf? How can I grow or learn or evolve through this situation? And I'll sometimes make something up. I'll simply make up that this guy had a real big fight with his wife last night and he can't get it off his mind. And so I just make it up. It's using the power of the mind, the power of interpretation to live a happier, healthy, more fruitful life without necessarily having to then go to the place of arguing that if bad things happen, wait a second, how is that? The whole problem of evil that Christians face or the monotheistic traditions face, that problem just dissolves when you get personification, when you get that the only way to relate in a healthy way to reality is to personify. That is to give a human-like characteristics to something that's more than human, non-human. Connie and I do it in every aspect of our life. The name that we've given for our relationship is Jasmine. We've given a personified mythic name for Jasmine. So there's Michael, there's Connie, and then there's Jasmine. And Jasmine is the whole that is more than the sum of the two of us. And by giving that mythic name, that personified name of Jasmine to us or to we, it's a sacred name for we or to us, it actually allows me as a man to not be attached to my position. And I can actually go with something that Connie might have suggested for in the first place, but not feel like she's won and I've lost. I feel like I'm proud that I'm stepping in and doing what's good for Jasmine. Now, why it is that Jasmine usually wants to do what she wanted to do in the first place, I haven't figured that one out. But, you know, a happy wife is a happy life, as they say. But the same thing. Well, our name for thus, what most people call the Son, little s, we call Great Soul. S-O-L. So you call it S-O-U-L, I like that too. But we sing to Great Soul. On every sunrise and sunset that we can see, we have this song that we sing. We sing to Great Soul. Gaia, obviously Earth, but Nora is our name for North America. It's our sacred personification. We don't relate to this continent as North America. We relate to this continent as Nora, and we're falling ever more in love with Nora as we travel the continent speaking. So this understanding of God as a personification or personalization, a right relationship to reality, becomes much easier when we personify reality. Whether you use the word God or the goddess or, you know, Allah or any divine name. I started to say earlier that this summer I reread Martin Buber's famous book, I and Thou. He was a great Jewish theologian. And he talks about that if we treat any aspect of nature or any person as an it to be exploited or used rather than a thou to be related to in a respectful, honorable way, God is not present. He said the divine is not present in that relationship when we're treating any aspect of nature or any person as an it rather than a thou. Well, what have we been doing for 400 years? For 400 years, we've been treating nature as an it to be exploited rather than a thou to be honored and to be in relationship to. And so that's where this understanding of God is revealed and expressed and incarnate in all of nature, our inner nature, our outer nature, our social nature, and our interpretive nature opens up entire new possibilities for how to live our lives in ways that that do allow us, whether we have cancer or not, to face our own mortality and the fact that we are not going to, in this body, live forever from a place of what religious people call the peace that passes understanding. And it also allows us to cherish our diversity. The fact that other people think differently or believe differently is not a bad thing. It's kind of like the diversity of a bioregion. You know, if you only had one type of species, you wouldn't have an Earth. It's the diversity of bioregion. It's the diversity of species that actually add to the health, and the same thing in consciousness. We don't have to have all the same metaphysics and theologies and beliefs, because our diversity can be a good thing as long as we don't kill each other over our beliefs. Yes, exactly, ourselves, right, exactly. And so it's cherishing our diversity, because what we have, and this is what I'm going to suggest, this is one of the main things I'm going to be preaching on this route, is what I'm going to suggest is that we have a core of common beliefs, not common beliefs, I'm sorry. We have a core of common values, common priorities. We have shared values, priorities, and commitments that we do ally on, that we agree on, even though we've got different metaphysics and different beliefs. And so that pool of common shared priorities, commitments, and values allows us to cherish our diversity, work together with people with very different beliefs in the service of a just, healthy, beautiful, and sustainably life-giving future for all of us. And that's good news, because it allows us to see that there's not this gulf between science and religion. Because when we realize that evidence is God's word, evidence is divine guidance, that every fact discovered by science, that any scientist in the world, any fact discovered is also reality revealing itself. So every fact discovered by science is a revelation of God. It's a divine revelation. And the interesting thing is, in fact, I understand John on Thursday night is going to be showing my TEDx talk. I did a program at Agape Spiritual Life Center called The 7 Gifts of Evolutionary Spirituality. It's about a half hour. I think he's showing that. But also I did a 20-minute TED talk, a TEDx talk, where I talked about evolutionary brain science and evolutionary psychology, what God has revealed through evidence about our nature, about our inner nature, that helps us understand why we and our children and our grandchildren sometimes struggle with addiction or temptation, or once we shoot ourselves in the foot, or we have difficulty losing weight, or whatever the case may be. When we understand what God has been revealing through science and understanding that in a sacred way, it allows us it helps us significantly so that our instincts can serve our life and our relationships rather than sabotage us. I mean, any young man, for example, who believes that he's tempted by internet porn because his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple is going to be clueless about how to live in integrity, in deepest integrity. So understanding our inner nature, our outer nature, our social nature, and our interpretive nature makes it much easier to align our life and our relationships with reality, with what reality has been really revealing for hundreds of years through all forms of evidence: scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence, including the evidence of our own experience, so that we can support each other and help each other and move in the direction of a healthy relationships and just have kick-butt joy in the process. Because what we realize is that here's the thing, and some of the books that we have out there are pretty scary. I've got literally the cream of the crop, the best of the best books on climate change and peak oil, but not just the scary stuff, but how to take this information so that we're inspired to live healthy, vibrant lives and support each other in doing so. Because I believe that we are in the early stages of a decades-long contraction. It's not a collapse. It's a contraction. Every empire in the history of humanity has gone through a period of a few hundred years of building and then a few hundred years of contraction. That's what empires do. They overextend themselves. And we're in that early stage. We're in the downhill stage of what's called Hubbard's Peak of oil. Every year for the last 25 years, we've been finding less and less oil, and now every year we're producing less and less oil. That means cheap, abundant energy is slowly going to go away. And so we're all going to experience hard times. But that's not necessarily bad news, folks. As a species, we've been out of right relationship with the air, the water, the soil, and the life of this planet. And I believe that, yes, we're going to experience what could be called the Great Reckoning. The Great Reckoning. That is where we've been out of right relationship to reality. We're going to now experience the consequences. But I think it's also the Great Homecoming. I think it's the prodigal species waking up in the pig pen, realizing we've squandered our inheritance, and we come back humbly to the Father, to reality, to God. And we are received with open, welcome arms when we have that stance of humility, that stance of gratitude, that stance of trust. And I believe it is possible that we will experience and co-create thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That is, as it is in the spiritual realm, the non-material realm, here embodied, manifest in our institutions. And yeah, it could take 200 or 300 years. But you know something? We've got to have the long vision. It's no longer just about the next decade. It's about, okay, I mean, imagine people living, I'll conclude on this note. Imagine people living in the year 1000. This is how our beliefs manifest, okay? Massive starvation in the year 1000 in Europe. Why? Because in the year 999, so many Christians in Europe thought the end of the world was, they didn't think it, they thought they knew it. The end of the world was going to happen in the year 2000. You're all going to go up, you know. And so they didn't plant their fields in the spring of 2000. I mean, in the spring of 1000. So there was massive starvation and famine. And yet, what they did in the year 1000 didn't in any significant way impact us today. And yet in the next 10 years, if we don't tax carbon in the next 10 to 15 years, what we are doing today will literally and horrifically impact people living 1,000 years from now, and plants and animals living 1,000 years from now. Because what we do today, we now have the power of the gods. We have the power to create and the power to destroy. And yet we're not operating with the wisdom of God. We need that wisdom. Not just in Ernest Holmes's writings, not just in the Bible or the Quran or any ancient text, but through all forms of evidence, so that we can work together in a way that's joyful, and a way that's joyful even when bad things happen, even when struggling, difficult times happen, because we've got each other. We realize that the power of our interpretation, that even when bad things happen, we can still say, how is this the universe conspiring on my behalf? How can I grow or learn or evolve? How can I get closer to my neighbors and my friends and my church family? I'll get into a lot more of this afternoon, but I want to just conclude on this one note. It comes back to a term that is used a lot in New Thought circles. It's been used this morning. Practical spirituality. Practical spirituality isn't just about spirits. It's about how to live a great life, how to have the healthiest of relationships, how to die a peaceful death, and how to leave a sweet legacy, and how to support others in doing the same. And that is, I think, what God is up to today. And that is where I think we can grow with each other. The more humble, the more generous we are in supporting each other in that. And science is our friend in that process. So I'll conclude my lesson this morning with one of my favorite one-line pieces of scripture. It's from Carl Sagan. Science is at least in part informed worship. Science is at least in part informed worship. Thank you. About my great story beads, my cosmic rosary during the workshop this afternoon.